there's one phrase that defines the globalization of recent decades, that phrase would be made in China. China has long been the great factory of the world. Toys, household appliances, kitchen utensils. No matter where you look, practically everything you can buy has passed directly or indirectly through China. But what if I told you that the era of made in China could be coming to an end? What if I told you that for years, China has been losing more and more companies and slowing down its international trade? Here, we're talking about medium-sized companies supplying big brands such as Sony or Apple. Many of them are moving their production outside the Asian giant, an opportunity that many countries, from Turkey to Bangladesh, are keen not to miss.
Apple wants to continue to shift its production away from China. Part of its strategy is to focus more on India.
To be more specific, companies like Samsung have already reduced their workforce in China by 2/3 since 2013. Or, returning to the case of Apple, the Cupertino giant already produces 1 out of every 20 iPhones in India, with projections of multiplying that figure by 5 in the next 2 years. So the question is, why is this happening? Why are companies leaving China? And perhaps more importantly, what kind of world might this disengagement between China and the Western economies bring about? Is it a danger that could affect us? Well, today on Visualeconomik, we answer all these questions, so stay tuned. To understand why many companies are fleeing China, or at least looking for alternatives to this market, the first thing we need to understand is why they decided to set up there in the first place. As many of you may already know, until not too long ago, China was a very unfriendly place to do business. For much of the 20th century, it was a country dominated by an iron-fisted communist dictatorship comparable to that of countries like Cuba or North Korea, a totalitarian, all-encompassing dictatorship headed by the supreme leader, Mao Zedong. I assure you that any business person at that time would have chosen any other country in the world rather than China to develop his or her business. However, starting in the 1980s, China began to attract thousands and thousands of companies to the country. The question is, why? How could the Chinese communist regime suddenly become attractive to business people from countries like the USA? Well, the answer lies in the year 1976, when Mao Zedong, the Chinese dictator, departed this world. After him came a new dictator who changed things completely, Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was a politician who was also part of the Chinese Communist Party, but who, nevertheless, had an economic vision that was very different from and critical of the one Mao had had up to that time. Let's just say that Deng Xiaoping was much more pragmatic and less blinded by the ideas of communism and his own revolutionary dreams. In fact, one of his famous phrases was that regardless of whether a cat was black or white, the important thing was that the cat caught mice. That is, regardless of whether a political measure was considered more or less socialist, the important thing was that it produced results. That is precisely why, starting in 1979, Deng Xiaoping launched a massive plan to get China's economy off the ground, a plan that basically consisted of opening up to the international market and attracting as many foreign companies as possible. In this way, the communist fiefdom of the People's Republic of China basically opened up its arms to capitalism, or at least we can say that it gave mainland China a foot in the door. The question then is, what concrete measures were carried out in this plan? Well, the answer can be summarized in 2 main elements. The first of these consisted of a 1979 law that allowed foreign companies to set up in China. Until the arrival of Deng Xiaoping, foreign companies were practically forbidden to enter the Asian nation, so this new law allowed them to enter the country. By the way, it is worth mentioning that at the beginning, foreign companies could only enter China if they gave part of the ownership of the company to the Chinese government, as if it were an alliance between the companies and the state. However, by 1986, that was already behind us. In any case, the second element to attract foreign companies was the creation of special economic zones. These special zones are places where foreign companies pay fewer taxes, have fewer government controls, more flexible bureaucratic procedures, and also have much more advanced infrastructure than in the rest of the country. Basically, you could say that the government created a luxurious environment where companies could operate easily and make a lot of money. The question is, did these measures work? Well, the truth is, yes. As you can see in this graph, the volume of foreign investment began to grow after the arrival of Deng Xiaoping. However, the Chinese government was not entirely satisfied with the results. Although the influx of foreign companies had increased, it was not enough, and the government wanted to attract even more. So what do you think he did to attract even more companies? Well, he launched a new plan that had even more important and profound perks than the previous one. This new plan basically consisted in expanding the first plan, at least in terms of taxation. In fact, they went so so far as to give advantages to foreign companies over local companies. For example, if a company was of Chinese origin, it had to pay taxes of about 25% of its profits. But foreign companies setting up subsidiaries, factories, and production centers in the country had to pay less, only between 10 and 15%. And that is not all. In addition, foreign companies could also subtract 100% of their workers' salaries from their taxes. And on top of that, if they reinvested their profits, they could save between 40 and 100% of the taxes they would have to pay. In the 1990s, investing in China became a real opportunity for two reasons. The first was the possibility of obtaining very advantageous tax treatment, and the second was that foreign companies could enter and compete in China's own market against the rest of the local companies that had to pay more taxes than the foreign ones. Basically, it was a VIP pass for foreign companies. And if we add to all this the fact that Chinese labor at that time was very, very cheap, the result is clear. International investment in the Asian giant skyrocketed. Of course, there were also trade-offs. Foreign companies, in addition to investing in the country, often had to team up with local partners who grew with them and, above all, learned from them. Be that as it may, as we've already seen at the beginning of this video, all this whirlwind of companies setting up in China seems to have suddenly started to slow down. Many companies are now considering reducing their exposure to China. Many are even deciding to leave. And the truth is that this is something that began to manifest itself at least a decade ago. Don't believe me? We'll take a look. Starting in 2008, the proportion of international trade in China's economy began to plummet. Since then, China has gone in a direction that is much less business-friendly, investment-friendly, and global economy-friendly. The question is, why? What is driving China off the course that made it grow so strongly in the past? Well, let's take a look.
The new Chinese lock.
Let's be clear. In 2008, China had already become the world's factory. Thousands of companies had arrived in the country, and its economy had taken off like a rocket. China was no longer that poor, miserable wasteland with no business activity at all, but had become an industrial powerhouse with a lot of muscle. Given this situation, it seems that the Chinese government thought that perhaps it was no longer necessary for the country to continue attracting so many foreign companies, if that meant harming local companies. In fact, it set to work doing the opposite, to start protecting Chinese industries and stop giving privileges to investors from other countries. For example, do you remember the tax advantages enjoyed by foreign companies in China? Well, the government, in an effort to raise more revenue, eliminated almost all of these advantages between 2008 and 2013. This in itself could be reason enough to explain the slowdown in foreign investment in China, but there is still more. Look, for example, at this graph. What you are seeing is the evolution of the wage cost in China over recent decades. From the early 2000s onwards, this cost skyrocketed. And this means that many companies decided to stop setting up in China in order to go to other countries such as Thailand or Vietnam, where labor is still cheap. But there was an additional factor, particularly over the last few years, that drove many companies away. What factor is that? None other than the political factor. On the 15th of March 2013, Xi Jinping, the current president of China, came to power. I remember how we told you that up until that time, China had pursued pragmatic policies far removed from communism. Well, in a way, this is how his term of office began. In his first economic program in 2013, Xi Jinping promised to take a decisive role in the market. And soon after, in 2014, a huge operation was launched to favor mass entrepreneurship in the country, which led to millions of new companies being created. Gradually, however, Xi Jinping left aside this pragmatism and gradually replaced it with pure and hard political ideology, at least for a kind of ideology of his own. And so, the goal of the current president, Xi Jinping, is not so much economic growth, but above all, to turn China into a dominant power, with a strong control over strategic sectors, such as semiconductors, a superpower with little dependence on the outside world. You don't believe me? Look at this.
The opening up of the Chinese economy is not going to continue. We have to move away from the idea that China's policy is still basically tailored to economic growth. Jörg Wuttke, president of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China.
The China that pursued openness to the world and growth by attracting capital is a very different China to the one we see today. However, not all of China's international lockout is the direct fault of Xi Jinping, because the truth is that other countries and politicians have helped to heat up the situation. Take a look.
Trump hits China with tariffs on $200 billion in goods, escalating trade war.
Let's be clear, in recent times, China has not been known for maintaining good relations with the rest of the developed world. On the one hand, its greatest rival, the US, started an absurd trade war led by Donald Trump that accelerated the process of China's disconnection with the rest of the West. But on the other hand, now that Trump is no longer at the helm, Joe Biden has not been in any rush to lift the sanctions either. What's more, Biden has approved strong restrictions on the sale of cutting-edge technology to China. We're talking about, for example, semiconductors. In addition, laws such as the Inflation Reduction Act provide subsidies for certain strategic companies that take their production out of China. The war between the two powers is in full swing in the economic field. What's more, even the social media platform TikTok could suffer the consequences of this deep enmity.
The US Congress already has an instrument to ban TikTok in the country, and Biden supports it.
In view of all this, it is worth noting one thing. If you think that China's economic rivalries are limited to the US, you're completely wrong. You see, the thing is, Xi Jinping has taken it upon himself to antagonize virtually every country around, from India to Malaysia, with the exception of perhaps Russia. And why? Well, largely because these countries increasingly see China as a threat to their integrity. In fact, it is these countries, not the West, that are most wary of China's ambition for dominance. Without going any further, as you can see in this 2017 study, in countries such as Vietnam, India, and South Korea, practically half of their citizens see China's growth as a real problem. So we could say that all these effects, that is, higher taxes, higher labor costs, and international tension, are why so many companies have started to leave China. However, how is all this going to affect us? Are we in danger of international trade collapsing in the next few years? Will this war be a major problem for our economies? Well, let's take a look.
Disconnection or deglobalization.
Over the last few decades, globalization, and therefore economic growth, have been synonymous with made in China. But of course, if China starts to remove itself from the economic map, it is possible that this made in China growth will also disappear. However, this does not mean that global economic growth will also disappear, but rather that it will possibly continue, but without the Asian giant, or at least with less participation from the Asian giant. This is something that we have discussed a lot on our sister channel, Visualeconomik. Countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, and even Mexico have been welcoming companies that formerly operated in China for years. What's more, some of these countries are already specializing in vitally important advanced technologies such as semiconductors. To give you an idea, 25% of Malaysia's exports are already integrated circuits, with a value of about $65 billion, compared to $40 billion exported by the United States, even though the American giant has a GDP 60 to 70 times larger than Malaysia's. Of course, all this does not mean that China's decoupling will be quick and painless in the short term. Whether we like it or not, China is still one of the largest markets on the planet, a market that accounts for more than 30% of the demand in important sectors, such as automobiles and semiconductors. In fact, thanks to its gigantic economies of scale and an army of engineers and highly qualified personnel, China leads in key industries such as electric cars. However, in the long run, China's growing enmity with the rest of the countries, both Western and Asian, could ironically unite its enemies and make them collaborate more than ever before. Countries such as the US, Malaysia, India, and Vietnam could join forces to accelerate China's disengagement, and that could give a new impetus to globalization. At least, a new era of globalization. You know the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Be that as it may, having come to this point, it is now your turn. To what extent do you think we will stop seeing made in China? Will the countries we have been talking about manage to attract investment coming out of China, or will we see a contraction in investment globally? Are we facing the end of globalization as we know it, or simply a new phase? You can leave me your answers in the comments below. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. Hey, if you like the video, please go ahead and like it. I'll be seeing you again in the next one. All the best. Have a great day.